The one thing I've learned over the past year and a half is that it's so hard to say anything with 100% confidence because we're just getting more and more data in, and it takes a while for this to compile. And also, as a world, we don't have a great system for this to compile this data, it feels like. But assuming that the mRNA vaccines are less effective on the variants than they are on the wildfire coronavirus, does that mean that the variants have two things that are variants? One being that their shape of their protein spikes is different, and that maybe whatever it is that they're delivering in terms of like the nature of the coronavirus is also different.
Right. So it's a great question, Sam. So the wild type, everything that we did was based on the wild type, right? But natural selection being what it is, it's going to force these viruses to try to evade either natural induced immunity, so people who have antibodies as a result of getting infection, versus vaccine induced immunity. So there is this pressure on these viruses to obviously stay alive, if you will. Viruses aren't really alive, but to stay alive and to evade immunity. So in answer to number one question, what happened was that this is the spike protein. There was a 20-degree shift in the spike protein itself. 20 degrees, boom, that was what they were able to do. And that is what B117. So all the variants have an element of B117 in which it was able to kind of just shift 20 degrees. And what that did was that it made the key that fits into the lock a lot easier. Imagine a sticky key that fits into a lock and you got to kind of wiggle it a little bit before you can kind of open it, right? That's what the wild type virus was, the Wuhan virus, the virus that emerged out of Wuhan. All these new viruses, they all have this 20-degree shift, and that's called convergence evolution, which is a really fascinating idea that you have these viruses from all over the world. They all jumped simultaneously, independent of one another. They all jumped to the next step in evolution, and that was to evade immunity by making it easier to get into our cells by making the key slip into the lock a lot easier. So that's answer number one, question number one. Number two is what you're asking is a couple of questions. Is how is it the virus is more virulent? In other words, we're seeing higher amounts of infectiousness, 30 to 50% with each of these variants. But why are we seeing in some cases that they're more virulent? In other words, that they actually could potentially cause more severe illness and potentially death? And why are we seeing younger people affected? And we don't know the answers to those questions yet. We have no idea, but we do know that B117, prior to people in the UK being vaccinated, it did kill more people, especially if you were older. But now that the elderly have been vaccinated in the UK, we're seeing that B117 does not affect them as much, but there is some element of virulence, and that's the severity, virus causing severity of disease that we are unaware of right now. And it's unusual in fact, it's almost unheard of. And it used to be a truism that a virus either becomes more infectious as it evolves or it becomes more virulent as it evolves. But what we've never really seen before, or at least I'm aware of, is a virus that becomes infectious and virulent simultaneously. And the reason is that it costs a lot of genetic energy to have both of those traits. So it's not ecological or evolutionarily advantageous for a virus to have those two traits. But we are starting to see it to a certain degree with some of these variants.
That sounds potentially ominous.
Yeah, I mean, the vaccines are really incredibly effective. I mean, like the mRNA vaccines are unbelievably effective, and as are the other ones. Novavax is really fascinating how that works, and that's and that has 92% efficacy. That is now circulating around the world. The Sinohan or the Covishield that came out of China has almost 80% efficacy, as does the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. So this gets us back to we need to do better. And of course, I completely support it, and I know you guys did too, when President Biden finally approved the TRIPS waiver to allow for the WTO to allow for these countries to generate their own vaccines. India, Thailand, and Brazil have amazing capacities to manufacture vaccines, but that should have been something that was approved in June or July, because we would not be in this situation now.
Let me ask you about that, because my understanding too is that, we heard Fauci mention this too, the transfer of technology, that when we changed the patent regime in this country and really around the world in the 90s with the WTO, that we allowed a company like Moderna, let's say, or Pfizer, to sort of keep a certain amount of the best practices, let's say, in producing the mRNA secret. Where it used to be, to apply for a patent, you got to give us all this stuff. We protect it as a government from other people using it, give you a legal right to sue or whatnot in the future. But in the 90s, we changed that so that they could hold back this material, and there was no and they have no legal obligation per se to provide it in this instance. So how do they get around that? How does a factory in India or wherever it is, that is going to produce the vaccine? Okay, Moderna said you can have the patent in terms of the ingredients, but we're not necessarily going to give you the best practices on how to make it because we don't have to.
Right. So let me just go back to HIV and just say that in the 90s, when we were seeing just huge amounts of mortality in Thailand, cases in Thailand and India, and then again Brazil, were the areas where it had the largest amount of cases. They just went ahead and then just started generating their own HIV medications based on what the U.S. was producing, and the U.S. manufacturers tried to sue them, but they were essentially shamed on the world stage because they were like, no, we need these medications to keep our people alive. And so that was kind of that set the precedent for, I think, what's happening here. Now, in specific answer to your question, it's a good question. I have no idea what the answer is. I've not heard that, but I do know that there's a precedent for that, in that these countries were able, and there's a great, I think it's on Netflix, or I forget where I saw it, but it's a great documentary on the Indian pharmacist who actually was the one that went up against these U.S. pharmaceuticals and showed how he had this manufacturing company, and he was able to produce these HIV medications and other medications that were able to help people in India specifically. But again, this is not the technology. Once the technology has been developed, chemists and biochemists around the world can easily reproduce it. Now, specifically to mRNA, I would imagine that's probably a very difficult technology because mRNA degrades so quickly. Like I said, you could think of it as the Snapchat of genetic material. And so there has to be very specific conditions that they work in. I just don't know enough about it from that perspective.